thanks to all of you for coming out tonight, and thanks most of all to the Mariners Museum for inviting me back here a number of times. I really enjoy being at this wonderful museum, and today I had a great docent tour, so if you haven't gone on a docent tour yet of the museum, I would recommend it. In case you're wondering, I'm coming down from Marblehead, Massachusetts today, so I was on a plane. It deserves a clap, yes. So I was on a plane this morning, and then I took a car down here, and it's always fun coming back here. But thank you very much. Left for Dead is a true story of a wild and fateful encounter between an American sealing vessel, a shipwrecked British brig, and a British warship on the Falkland Islands during the War of 1812. Fraught with misunderstanding and mistrust, the incident left 3 British sailors and 2 Americans, including the captain of the American sealing vessel, Charles Barnard, marooned on the Falkland Islands for nearly 2 years. It's a tale involving British and Americans meeting under the most stressful circumstances in a time of war. Kindness and compassion, drunkenness, the birth of a child, treachery, greed, lying, a hostile takeover, stellar leadership, ingenuity, severe privation, the great value of a good dog, perseverance, endurance, threats, bullying, banishment, a perilous 1,000-mile open ocean journey in a 17.5-foot boat, an improbable rescue mission in a rickety ship, and legal battles over a dubious and disgraceful wartime prize. And yes, I have to tell you, that is an actual sentence from the book. Most of my sentences don't have quite as many commas as that, but I like that sentence a lot. And my wife, who's the first reader of all of my books, when she started reading my books, she nicknamed herself the Kamikaze, because I did the last English class I took was in high school. And I guess I didn't learn when and where to place commas, but I've gotten better over time. Now, the centerpiece for the book is the cold and extremely windy Falkland Islands, and they are cold. The average temperature during the winter is 36 degrees, and in the summer it rises to a balmy 49 degrees. But what really makes it cold is that year-round, the average wind speed is 18 miles per hour. So if you do the math, it's a very cold place. And back during the time at which this story took place, there wasn't a single tree on the Falklands. Today, there are trees in Port Stanley and a few other places, but back then, you could not escape from the constant winds. It's a sprawling archipelago of roughly 700 islands, but really, if you count the islands that are visible at high tide, it's really more like 200 islands, but still quite a few. It's located roughly 300 miles from the east coast of Argentina and almost directly across from the Strait of Magellan. Now, the Falklands have a stark beauty. The rugged landscape is undeniably spectacular. And keep in mind, this is New Ireland. It plays a central role in the book. Now, I love this picture, and do you know what all that white stuff is on the rocks? Guano. Yeah, the Falklands happens to be the #1 nesting area in the world for black-browed albatrosses. There are 700,000 pairs, so they leave behind little presents like this. And if you ever want to read interesting history, you should read about the guano wars off Peru in the 1800s. It's absolutely fascinating. Now here's a settlement rookery in a storm. And most of these pictures, I mean, not most of the color pictures that look modern were taken by a photographer who happens to live on New Ireland. Her name is Georgina Strange, and her father, Sir Ian Strange, owned New Ireland at one point, and he gave it over to be a nature preserve, which is what it is today. Now, this is one of my favorite pictures in the book. It really gives you a sense of how alien the landscape of the Falklands is. The flora, such as this sea cabbage and this wild celery, as well as the fauna, is also striking. This picture, taken by Georgina Strange, graces one of the Falkland Islands stamps. And also a barn owl plays a little role in the book as well. Now, with regards to Left for Dead, the most important animals on the Falklands are the seals. Barnard and his crew of 12 men, along with his trusty dog Scent, left New York Harbor and headed to the Falklands on April 12th of 1812 on board the Nanina, a 73-foot-long brig, and they hoped to strike it rich by getting a hold full of seal skins, which could be sold in China. Now, this picture from the 1790s, or this engraving, does not show seal skins. It actually shows sea otter skins. And if you know your history, and if you read my book, Fur, Fortune, and Empire, or my China book, you would realize that the sea otter trade was a major endeavor in the United States, the newly minted United States. And at this point, sea otter pelts in China could garner $100 a piece. Now, seal skins were much less valuable. You could only get about 50 cents to $5 a piece, depending on the quality and whether they were fur seal skins or hair seal skins, or sea lions. But to get a sense of the magnitude of this industry, the sealing industry, between the late 1700s and about the War of 1812, somewhere on the order of 2.5 million to 3.5 million seals were slaughtered. So it was a very large industry. It was not as big as the whaling industry, but it was considerable nonetheless. Now, it wasn't only seal skins that they were after. They also wanted to kill elephant seals and strip them of their thick layers of blubber, throw them into iron trypots, melt down the blubber, and from that blubber came a very clean-burning oil, much like spermaceti oil. In fact, it was second only in value and burning characteristics to sperm oil. So that was another way to get a good illuminant into commerce. Now, the Nanina arrived on New Island on the western edge of the uninhabited Falklands on September 7th of 1812 and moored in Hooker's Harbor, which is right there. It's not named after prostitutes, but Hooker's Harbor, or that's more Civil War territory. Anyway, this is one of the 3 maps that I had created for the book by a wonderful illustrator, David Kane, who is in New York City. Now, Barnard took a great chance leaving New York on the eve of what everybody thought was going to be the Second American Revolution, the second big war with Great Britain. And on January 3rd of 1813, after the Nanina had been on the Falklands for a number of months, they got word that the war had begun the previous June. Another sealing vessel, the Hope, came by and told them that the war had begun. Now, the contract that Charles Barnard signed with the owners of the Nanina required him to return immediately to the nearest American port should hostilities erupt. But he took a vote, essentially. They had a meeting with everybody on board the Nanina, and they decided jointly that instead of going back to the United States and risk getting captured by a British warship, wouldn't it be much better to stay in the Falklands where there was nobody else around, continue sealing for the better part of a year, gather a lot of fur seal skins, and then hopefully by that time the war would be over and they could go back to the United States with essentially money in their pockets. But they couldn't stay on New Island, which is way up here, because New Island was a favorite stopping point for British ships of all types, and especially during times of war. If any ship was going into the Pacific Ocean around Cape Horn, they would stop off at the Falklands very often to get fresh water, which is plentiful, and also to kill birds and hogs. Hogs had been left there by mariners in previous decades so that they would multiply and create a sustaining source of food for those who followed thereafter. So what they decided to do is they went from here, New Island, all the way over to Barnard's Harbor. And Barnard was one of the first people to draw a map of the Falkland Islands. And if you read the book, you will discover that Barnard was a bit of an arrogant character, so a number of things on the Falklands in his map were named after himself. I suppose that's the honor that goes to those who come first. Now, they continued sealing. This is an engraving from about the 18 teens. They continued sealing, and everything was going fine, and they thought they were alone. But in April, they discovered that they were not. Months earlier, on December 4th of 1812, the 193-ton brig Isabella sailed out of Port Jackson Harbor in the British penal colony of New South Wales, which you know as Sydney Harbor in Australia. The brig's destination was London via Cape Horn. In addition to a cargo of sealskins, whale oil, and mother-of-pearl shells that were to be turned into buttons, the Isabella had 54 people on board, including 34 passengers, 14 of whom were armed British Marines going home for some rest and relaxation. There were also 10 people on board who were pardoned convicts or ones who had served out their time. And among those, there were 4 female prostitutes, one of which plays a minor role in the book. After nearly crashing into an island south of New Zealand and barely surviving a tempestuous sail around Cape Horn, the Isabella crashed into Eagle Island on the Falkland Islands on February 8th. And it came to rest on a rock ledge close to shore. Now, you may be wondering why this ship had so many problems on its way around Cape Horn, and that's because the captain of the ship, a guy named George Hickton, was an alcoholic, and he preferred being below than conning the ship and playing cards and also spending time with one of the former female prostitutes. So luckily, there was another captain on board who took the helm right before they crashed into the Falklands. That was not their destination. They were trying to make it to Rio de Janeiro. They were way off course. It was a bad storm, but luckily he was able to get the ship relatively close into the land. And they crashed down here. That's Eagle Island. That's where the crash was. And they managed, miraculously, all of them got ashore. And that's because they first hit this reef, which was a ways offshore, and then they sort of bounced in to the point where when they cut down one of the masts, it almost touched the shore so they could get off the ship. Now, Eagle Island, I want to say something about Eagle Island. Eagle Island, or Speedwell Island now, is about 7 miles long and about 3 miles wide. During the course of working on this book, I got in contact with the people who own Eagle Island. It's Chris and Lindsay May. They live on that island entirely by themselves, with the exception of 60,000 sheep. And they have a son who is on a neighboring island, but he's just a piker when it comes to sheep. He only has 30,000 sheep. So needless to say, in the Falklands, there are way more sheep than there are people, and you can make whatever jokes you want out of that come to mind, especially if you saw, anybody see the movie Sleeper with Gene Wilder and the scene with the woolite and the sheep? No? Okay, go see it, it's pretty funny. Anyway, they offloaded most of the cargo and created a makeshift settlement. This is one of the anchors from the Isabella. It looks deceptively small, but actually it's almost 13 feet long, and if both flukes had been there, it would have been about 7 feet across. A few weeks later, the survivors decided to send 6 men off on the 17.5-foot longboat. They had a double mission, or a 2-part mission. First, they were to sail around the Falkland Islands looking for what they hoped would be a British or a Spanish settlement, because in years past, there had been British and Spanish settlements there. If they found one, they were to get help. If they didn't find such a settlement, they were to sail 1,200 miles all the way to Buenos Aires, which is quite a hike in a 17.5-foot boat that they had to modify a bit to make the voyage. Well, they didn't find anybody on the Falkland Islands because the Spanish, who had been there up until 1811, had cleared out, and the British had been gone for quite a while. They actually made it all the way to Buenos Aires, where they met with a guy named Peter Heywood, who was the captain of the HMS Nereus, the British warship that was on station in Buenos Aires. The reason I have Mutiny on the Bounty image up here is that Peter Heywood was on the Bounty, and he was brought up on charges later because he claimed that he wanted to get off the ship but was prevented from doing so, wanted to go with Captain Bligh. When Bligh got back to London, he claimed that Heywood was one of the conspirators. He was put on trial and he was sentenced to death, but then at the last moment, the king gave him a reprieve and he resuscitated his naval career, and he ended up going to South America and being the chief commander on station. Now, Haywood was very sympathetic to what had happened to the castaways. He wanted immediately to send a ship to save them. He didn't have many options available. There was this HMS Nancy, a relatively small, somewhat decrepit ship. He tapped that ship and he got a captain, William Peter Duranda, to take the ship down to the Falklands to save the castaways. In the meantime, the situation back in the Falklands had taken a dramatic turn. In early April of 1813, Barnard and a few of his men had taken the Nina's shallop, the young Nina, which is a small boat. They took it about 80 or 90 miles away looking for seals. They went into Fox Bay. While they were there looking for seals, they saw smoke rising off of Eagle Island. So they decided, that was about 25 miles away, so they decided to go investigate. And upon investigating, they came upon the castaways from the Isabella. Now, despite the fact that the United States and Great Britain were at war, Charles Barnard and the Americans decided to do the humanitarian, the right thing. They offered to save all of the castaways, bring them back to a South American port, or possibly even the United States, and all that they asked for in exchange was the right to salvage what was left of the Isabella, take the cargo minus personal effects. Now, the reason that Barnard argued that this was a good deal is that by doing that, the Americans were giving up the rest of their sealing voyage, and they had already killed many, many seals. So they were losing an opportunity to profit, and they felt since they were helping the British, they should be able to recoup some of their costs. This is an engraving from 1829, supposedly showing their little settlement called Newtown, Providence. I can guarantee you it did not look this neat. Now, the castaways greatly outnumbered the American sealers. Remember, even with the 6 men gone, there were still 48 British, including all of the armed British Marines. They could have easily overpowered the Americans and taken control of the Nina and taken the ship themselves back to South America. Nevertheless, all of the British, except for one rather unscrupulous guy, decided to take the Americans' offer. They thanked them very much, and that's where it was left for a moment. But then Barnard realized that the British didn't know that the war had begun. So he was concerned that if he continued without telling them that the war had begun, one of his men would have loose lips, and then the British would feel as if they had been double-crossed. So Barnard decided he had to tell them that the war had started and then take the vote again. He told them that the war had begun, and the British, once again, even though they realized they were now enemies of the Americans, they decided to continue with this deal. And that was a very humane and correct thing to do from my perspective. Barnard left some of his men behind, right on Eagle Island, and he took about 22 of the British, and he went all the way back to Barnard's Harbor. He was going to get the Nina ready to sail. Now, he wanted to go all the way around here, but this is during the winter. This is bad weather, and this is called an iron-bound shore, meaning that from here to here, there's not a single place to pull a boat in. All it is sheer cliffs. And the weather was too bad, so he couldn't make it. So what he did is he pulled in to right here. He took most of the British, hiked a number of miles across to Barnard's Harbor. Then he got some of his experienced mariners. They hazarded the trip around here, saved the last few of the people that were staying here, and brought them back safely. On May 13th, there was a reunion. The young Nina was reunited with the Nina, and Barnard and his men, along with all of the British, began putting up the sails, the spars, the rigging of the Nina to get ready to leave the Falkland Islands. At the very same moment, Commander Duranda and the HMS Nancy arrived at Eagle Island, and his arrival dramatically altered the Americans' and the Britain's plan. Duranda immediately tossed aside the agreement that the Americans and the British had reached. He didn't care that the Americans had done the right thing. He declared the Americans prisoners of war, and their ship was going to be a prize of war. And despite the fact that all of the castaways had felt so favorably disposed towards their rescuers, the Americans, not a single one of them spoke up and argued with Duranda about his decision to turn the tables on the Americans. So Duranda waited for the Nanina to arrive so he could claim it as a prize of war. But first came the shallop, the young Nanina, which is sort of like a probably 25-foot boat that they actually built when they got to the Falkland Islands so they could go on extended sealing voyages. The young Nanina arrived at Eagle Island on May 16th. It was promptly declared a prize, and all the Americans on board were made prisoners of war and restricted to their tent, essentially. As the days turned into weeks and the Nanina failed to arrive, Duranda got quite worried. He had been told by the people on the young Nanina that the Nanina was supposed to be right behind, so he assumed that it must have sunk in the bad weather that was blanketing the area. Well, it hadn't sunk, but something quite troubling had occurred. Atrocious weather and adverse winds kept the Nanina from heading to Eagle Island for weeks on end. It had to pull in to Ship's Harbor because the weather was so bad. And on June 3rd, with the storm showing no sign of letting up, Barnard came to a decision. He decided that it would be foolhardy to continue on to Eagle Island with the weather being so bad. They needed to stay at New Island for a couple of weeks, maybe even a month or more, until the weather cleared up, and then they can go to Eagle Island, pick up the British castaways, and take them away from the Falkland Islands. So he recommended to Captain Dury here, Captain Dury, who is the captain, the head of all the British Marines, he said, listen, we can't go right now. Are you okay with us staying here? And Dury, who had experienced some really bad weather just on the way to New Island, said, of course, let's wait until the weather changes. But he decided he had to present this to the rest of the British. He told them the situation. They all agreed. Nobody wanted to sail right now. They pulled into Hooker's Harbor because this was a little bit too exposed. So they warped around into here, and they put out 3 anchors. Excuse me, allergies. They put out 3 anchors to keep them from being slammed into the shore. Just over a week later, there was a break in the weather, and Barnard stepped forward with another humanitarian gesture. Everybody was quickly running out of food, so he proposed taking the jolly boat that was on the Nanina, bringing it to Beaver Island with some other people, going on a short hunting trip to kill some hogs, kill some waterfowl, bring them back to everybody else who was fast running out of food. Minutes after he proposed this hunting trip, all of the British rushed forward and said, no, we've got to leave immediately. We have to go to Eagle Island right away. Barnard said, calm down. I'll be back in 2 or 3 days. We'll have food to make the voyage to Eagle Island. You'll still get there fairly soon. Placated for the moment, the British dropped their demand. Now, believing things were under control, Barnard asked for volunteers. 4 people volunteered, 1 American and 3 British sailors. They got into the jolly boat, they shoved off, and they rowed and sailed the 12 miles to Beaver Island, where they began hunting. They left on June 11th. On June 13th, the British renewed their demand that the Nanina leave right away without delay, now that the fair weather had returned. On board the Nanina was a guy named Valentine Bernard. Valentine Bernard happened to be Charles Bernard's father. He was 63 years old. He had 2 hernias. He was being held together by multiple trusses. And you'll have to read the book to find out why such an elderly man, especially at this time, was on a ship like this. But he was there, and he became apoplectic. He says, you cannot leave right now. My son and the other men are off hunting. Let's wait until they come back. They'll be back soon, and then we will leave. The British wouldn't have it, and they stood fast. Growing more alarmed, Barnard appealed to Captain Dury. He was the head honcho of the British Marines. What he said would go. Dury, however, was far from being sympathetic to the Americans' plight, and he sided with the other castaways, stating that he, quote, had no objection to the brig proceeding. Valentine was shocked by this answer. He said, "Your Marines are under your charge, and I demand of you assistance. And if you do not assist me, I conclude that you take charge, and you shall be accountable for whatever happens." Unfortunately for Valentine and the missing men, Dury lacked a spine of steel. He ignored Valentine's pleas. Over the continued objections of the Americans, the British finished preparing the Nanina to leave. And on June 14th, before the hunting party had returned, they were ready to set sail. But one of the Americans knew something that the British didn't seem to be fully aware of. And that was sailing in the Falkland Islands is extremely difficult, even if you know your way around. A lot of really bad rip currents, a lot of rocks right under the water. It's a very dangerous place to sail. So he made a deal because he had been to the Falklands many times before. He said, "I will sail the Nanina and all of you back to Eagle Island to pick up the rest of the castaways if you stop at Beaver Island and pick up the hunting party." The British agreed, and they took off. But when the Nanina drew abreast of Beaver Island, the British reneged on their deal. They refused to send in a boat or even briefly come to anchor. All they did was fire 2 shots and slow down for a bit, and then they zoomed off. And Valentine was incredibly upset, as you might understand, as were the other Americans. And he argued, he said, to leave the crew on this island, Beaver Island, in the depth of a dreadfully severe winter without food, raiment, or shelter was the equivalent of a death sentence. Unmoved, the British sailed off. When the Nanina arrived at Eagle Island, Duranda promptly made all the Americans prisoners of war and took the Nanina as a prize of war. This is a picture of the northern reaches of Eagle Island. At the time, the grass there would have been much, much higher, but when you have 60,000 sheep on an island, you don't tend to keep your grass very, very high. Now, the most plausible explanation for why Duranda decided to take the Nanina as a prize was that he was motivated by profit and glory, the glory of capturing a prize of war and collecting the money that would come from the sale of the ship and its cargo. And if you want to learn more about the regulations of prizes during wars, my book, Rebels at Sea, Privateering the American Revolution, talks about that in great detail. Now, in the coming weeks, remember, the British are here. The Nancy is up here. The castaways are down here. They're transporting stuff back up and down. The Americans are way over there, about 100 miles away, the hunting party. The Americans begged Duranda to send a ship, a boat, the young Nanina, to pick up the hunting party. They begged him for weeks on end, and he refused. Finally, 3 weeks after they had arrived on Eagle Island, he sent a boat. But he didn't place a single person on the boat who knew their way around the Falklands, and I think that was intentional. And maybe he even gave them instructions not to go very far, because all they did is they sailed across, whoops, I've lost the pointer. That's okay. Oh no, that's funny, look at that. I could see it on here. There it is, can you see it? No. Anyway, all they did is sail across Falkland Sound to Fox Bay for about 2 days, and then they came back. Obviously, they didn't pick up the hunting party. On July 27th, that's okay, I don't need to point that much more. On July 27th, exactly 170 days after the Isabella slammed ashore, and 44 days since the 5-man hunting party had been left on Beaver Island, the Nancy and the Nanina left the Falkland Islands. They promptly lost the young Nanina. The young Nanina was tied off to the back of the Nanina, but it was really bad weather and the rope severed and the young Nanina went off into the deep blue sea. Fortunately, nobody was on board. Now, the passengers and crew on the two vessels could only imagine what had happened to the hunting party. But what they imagined was almost certainly not as dramatic as what actually occurred. The hunt on Beaver Island had gone well. They had killed a number of hogs and birds, and they were ready to go back. But when they sailed back to New Ireland late on June 14th, right as it was getting dark, the Nanina wasn't there. A frantic search at dawn turned up nothing. Refusing to believe that he and the other men had been barbarously deserted in the depths of winter, Barnard seized on another explanation. The Nanina must have gone back to Beaver Island to pick them up, but it went to the opposite side of the island from where they were hunting. So with this slender hope, they got back in their boat. They went back to Beaver Island. Whoops, wait a second. Let me see if oh, there. Hey, it's back. This is New Island. That's Beaver Island in the distance. So they went back to Beaver Island, and they went to the opposite side of the island from where they had originally been hunting. But when they sailed into the main harbor, as Barnard later recalled, they experienced the almost insupportable anguish of neither finding the brig nor discovering any trace that it had been there. They had been cruelly abandoned at the beginning of a Falklands winter with absolutely no explanation as to why they'd been left in such a horrific predicament. On June 15th, the men latched on to another idea. The Nanina must have gone back to Eagle Island. So even though the weather was bad, even though they were in a small rickety boat, they were going to try to hazard a trip back to Eagle Island to catch the Nanina before it departed. And keep in mind, they know nothing about the HMS Nancy, the British warship. So, for more than a month, what they had wanted to do, what they had wanted to do is go over here down to McConkling's Lagoon, then hike across the land, dragging their boat, and go into Port Stevens Harbor and come out here. Because as you remember, I said from here to here is an iron-bound coast. They're too dangerous to try to sail, especially in such a small boat. Well, for about a month, even though Barnard knew his way around the Falklands, they got lost. It was dark, it was snowing, there were a lot of blizzards. So instead of going down here, they went over here, they went all the way up here, they went to Pinch Gut Camp, which is called Pinch Gut Camp because they didn't have much food. They were very hungry, they were sort of emaciated. They came back, they went to Swan Island, they established a makeshift camp. They basically slept under their overturned boat. And they decided, once again, we're going to go out and we're going to try to make it back here. This time, they made it to McConkling's Lagoon. Two of the guys hiked, it's about 800 feet right there. They hiked to here. They looked over the over the top of the hill. They knew it was Port Stevens Harbor, but by that point, there were 6 or 7 inches of snow on the ground. They were freezing, they were shivering, they were hungry. They couldn't make it. They went back, and then to make things even worse, this McConkling's Lagoon, as most lagoons do, in fact, all lagoons, has 2 sides. So the men that were waiting for them were on this side. The guys that came back from their hike in the middle of the night went up that side. They went halfway up when they saw the fire burning across the lagoon. They had to make it all the way back. They were almost dead when they arrived back, and they decided, that's it, we can't make it to Eagle Island. We're going to go back to Swan Island, to our rudimentary camp, and stay there for a while. Now, after the Nancy and the Nanina left Eagle Island, they split up. The Nancy headed to Buenos Aires, and Duranda then made his way to Rio de Janeiro, where the Nanina was waiting for him. In Rio, this guy, and I love his name, Rear Admiral Sir Manly Dixon. That's the name you need if you're an admiral, Manly Dixon. He met with Duranda, and he was furious. First, he said, you shouldn't have taken the Nanina as a prize. You shouldn't have made those nice Americans prisoners of war. They were trying to help British citizens. And then when he found out that they had left behind a hunting party that had 3 British citizens among it, he got even more upset, and he desperately wanted to find a way to make a deal with Valentine Barnard to give him back the Nanina, and maybe he could go back to the Falklands and rescue the hunting party. They haggled for a couple of days, and they couldn't reach an agreement. So finally, Manly Dixon threw up his hands in disgust. He said, "That's it. I'm sending the Nanina back to London. The prize court can figure out who owns it. I'm sorry, Valentine." While Valentine was negotiating with Dixon, the other Americans made their way back home on various vessels. It took months to get back. And when they got back, they had with them a protest that they had written while they were in Rio de Janeiro. It was about a 25-page document that detailed everything that had happened to them on the Falklands, both before the British showed up and afterwards. And it was deposited with the American Consul in Rio de Janeiro. It was sent by packet to the Secretary of State back in the United States, but the men also brought copies with them. And when they got back to the States, in particular, Hudson, New York. I don't know if any of you have been to Hudson, New York. That's where a lot of these men started out from. And there's a fascinating story there because Hudson, New York is a place that many Nantucket whalemen went right at the end of the American Revolution because they felt too exposed after the Revolution to continue whaling from there. So they started whaling from 100 miles up the Hudson River in Hudson, New York. And if you ever go to Hudson, New York, you'll see that their street signs have little whales on them. And so there's a reason for that. Anyway, they brought back with them this protest. And one of the papers, the Hudson Bee, published the protest and prefaced it with a paragraph that was written by the editor. I'm going to read that to you now because I love it. "We request the attention of the reader to the following account of the almost unparalleled ingratitude and treachery of the crew of a British ship to the crew of an American vessel, the latter having saved the lives of the former, whose vessel had been wrecked. And they, in return for this humane act, seized and made prize of the vessel and property of their preservers. Were it not that such a nation as Britain existed, this act of treachery might be correctly styled unparalleled. But British history is full of incidents of such black ingratitude." I'm sorry if any of you are currently British. Don't worry, every country has history that they'd rather forget. "Such conduct, even in our enemy, cannot fail to call forth the indignant feelings of every American who has a drop of patriotic blood flowing in his veins. When the owners of the Nina, John Murray and Sons in New York City, finally heard what had happened, they were hamstrung. They couldn't really do anything. The war was still raging. They couldn't send a rescue mission. A rescue mission, even if it wasn't at risk of being captured by a British warship, would have been very expensive. It had already been a long time, and everybody thought that the hunting party had died, and they couldn't go to London to argue their side of the case. So they had to wait until the war was over, but they had no idea what happened to the hunting party. But if they had known, I think they would have been amazed and impressed. The men in the hunting party survived on their own for a total of 534 days, most of the time living on New Island. They made clothes and shoes out of seal skins. They subsisted mainly on a diet of hogs, geese, seals, native plants, potatoes, which had been planted by earlier mariners, and albatross and penguin eggs. And I remember when I read this, I thought, of course, because since I'm a modern person, I thought, boy, I'm glad they didn't know about cholesterol in the early 1800s, because these guys ate a lot of eggs, and these eggs aren't small ones like we eat. They were huge. And they built a rudimentary hut out of sod, driftwood, sealskins, and the ribs of whales. And this is another engraving showing, I'm not quite sure, Charles Bernard sort of furtively looking over the tussock grass. Now, to cook and stay warm, they burned vines, driftwood, and the peat underlying the dense growths of grass. This tussock grass is fascinating. It can live for up to 200 years, grow 9 feet tall. It generates a very thick layer of organic peat that burns almost as well as coal. And when the first Westerners came upon the Falkland Islands, they mistook the tussock grass that covered the islands with palm trees. How they could think they were palm trees, given that it was probably 45 degrees out, I don't know, but that's what some of the things they wrote about. Now, during this long period, the men got into a few fights. They had many adventures and misadventures, and they faced a lot of adversity. They went on numerous hunts with Barnard's trusty dog, Scent, taking the lead, and often being gravely injured in his battles with hogs, who had sharp tusks jutting from their lower and upper jaws, with just modified incisors. At one point, Scent had his hindquarters gored. Another time, he had one of his eyes popped out, yet he continued to hunt. And I have to tell you, I've spoken to a lot of people who've read the book. People love Scent. And I remembered a story back when I wrote a book about China. It's one of my favorite books. It's called When America First Met China, but it's also my worst selling book. And I was being interviewed on NPR, and at the end of the interview, the guy asked me, he goes, what's your next book? And I already knew that the China book was not doing too well. So I looked at him, I said, people love puppies. I'm gonna write a book about puppies. And he looked at me and he goes, if you write a book about puppies, you're not coming back on this show. So that's not why I haven't written a book about puppies, but I'm still convinced if I write a book about dogs, that's the ticket. So maybe one of these days. Now, at one point, believe it or not, the other men abandoned Barnard without any explanation. And not only did they abandon him, taking almost everything, including his clothes, they also took his trusty dog, Scent. Now, they had a tough time surviving on their own. They came back 2 months later, figuratively with their tail between their legs. And I'm sure, but Scent was very excited to see his owner. And Barnard, who was a religious man, he was a Quaker, but he was sort of a lapsed Quaker. He'd been kicked out of Quaker meeting because he married a non-Quaker, and he was married by a hireling priest. But he still was quite religious, and he decided to turn the other cheek and take these men back into the fold. And he did, and he said, let's not talk about this anymore. But believe it or not, one of the guys who had been the mastermind between the others leaving Barnard behind, he was a born bully. And he kept acting poorly, so poorly that the other 4 men, including Barnard, marooned him on a neighboring island for a couple of months. So some bad behavior going on there. Now, one of the men's most exciting and dangerous adventures was when they went sealing on the southwestern edge of New Island, where the cliffs were almost 200 feet high. This engraving is not quite correct. The cliffs didn't bow in. They sort of angled like that. And the reason that's so they could rappel down. And I just noticed that if some of you saw my hand, you see they're black. That's because yesterday I was doing insulation work in my house. We just bought a new house. It's actually an old house, 1753. And I was crawling around in the basement doing insulation and putting spray foam. So my hands are covered in stuff because I know I'm getting filmed. And somebody's going to say, look at his hands. They're really dirty. And my mother would be very upset. So anyway, that rope is made out of sea lion skins. They only had one painter, a small rope from the boat. They couldn't make it down to where the seals were. So what they did is they took their one lance, they killed some very old sea lions, they peeled their skin off, much like you would peel an apple in one continuous twirl, and then they would ravel together multiple seal skins, let them dry for a number of days, tie them together, and that created that rope, which was able to hold not only their weight, but also the weight of the pelts that they cut off of the seals at the bottom of the mountain. Just an amazing, they had a lot of guts. Actually, 2 of the guys up top, 2 of the guys were so scared they wouldn't even look over the edge. But fortunately, they had 2 guys that were willing to rappel down. Now, the men's lonely and harsh existence on the Falkland Islands came to an end on November 25th of 1814, when the British whaling ships Indispensable and Asp arrived and saw the castaways on the shore. Actually, what had happened is when Duranda and then Nina got back to London, he got a really bad name because word got out what he had done on the Falkland Islands, and most people agreed with Sir Manley Dixon that he had done the wrong, dishonorable thing. So the British Navy sent out circulars all over the world to their stations saying, if anybody goes to the Falkland Islands, look for the hunting party and bring them back. the captain of the Indispensable had read that circular. However, when he came to the Falklands, he had forgotten about it. He was just there to get water and maybe kill a few hogs. But then he saw two guys that looked really bad waving to him from the shore, and he put two and two together. This is the hunting party. They picked them up. They split the men between the two whale ships, and on November 29th of 1814, they left the Falkland Islands, 534 days after they had been left behind. In an unusual coincidence, on the very day that Barnard and the others left the Falkland Islands, that was the same day, thousands of miles away in London, that the Admiralty Court was deciding on the fate of the Nanina. Now, the prize case appeared to be quite simple. Duranda submitted his side of the story, and there was nobody there to dispute him. So the prize court gave Duranda the rights to the Nanina and its cargo. However, there was one condition. There was a year-long appeal period during which anybody could come along and dispute the court's findings. After the war ended, the peace made it possible for John Murray and Sons, the owners, to go to London to argue their side of the case, and they did immediately. They arrived there in June of 1815, and they launched a legal attack. And as a result, the Advocate General of the Civil Court urged Murray to appeal instantly the condemnation of the Nanina, stating, quote, "There is reason to think that the capture ought not to have been made." Appeal Murray did. His barrister or lawyer submitted the paperwork on November 28th, 1815, one day before the one-year appeal period would have run out. Finally, on February 5th of 1818, the prize appeal court of the High Court of the Admiralty sided with the Murrays. They would be compensated for the cost of both the Nanina and its cargo, and Duranda was left with nothing, a fact that he continued to complain about for the rest of his life. And he was a young guy. He was in his mid-20s at the time. So, we're almost done. Barnard's journey back home was long and fascinating. I have a whole chapter about it. Just think about it. This is the early 1800s. These British whale ships, when they picked up the survivors, they weren't going to go back to America. Well, certainly it was a war. They weren't going to go back to America or even go back to England. They were out there to whale, so they went around Cape Horn into the Pacific Ocean, and Barnard had to go along with them. So he was on a whaling ship, then he went to Peru, he went to the Sandwich Islands or Hawaii, and he went to Canton, and finally, years later, nobody knew what had happened to him, he made it back to New York at the end of October of 1816. He had the unspeakable happiness, as he wrote, of being back home in New York, where he was reunited with his family and the owners of the Nanina, who were all very pleased and shocked to see him alive. Now, this is an engraving of South Street Seaport. Have many of you been to South Street Seaport? Great place. I gave a talk on this book there earlier this summer. And I can tell you, South Street Seaport does not look like this anymore. In fact, I had a $6.50 latte right there on that corner and some sushi right around the corner. So it's a much fancier place today, but it must have been amazing to see back then when New York was the leading port in the country. Now, the rest of Barnard's life was not particularly noteworthy, and included stints as a warden in the port of New York and as a captain on a lightship that was moored off of Sandy Hook, New Jersey. And lightships are basically lighthouses on a ship that help you navigate into a port. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that I wrote a book about lighthouses called Brilliant Beacons, which is one of my favorite books. Anyway, it was a lot of fun. After encouragement from his friends, Barnard finally wrote a book about his experience. And earlier today, some of you may have seen that book was on display. The Mariners Museum has it in their collection. And it's a fascinating book. And that's actually how I got the idea for this book. But I'll tell that story in a second because I always get asked the question. So Barnard finally died on November 13th of 1863. He was 83 years old. And the New York Herald is one of the few papers that noted his passing, and all they gave him was a single sentence obituary, and they didn't mention his time on the Falklands, the signature event in his entire life. And I have to think, I don't know if I tend to write books about people that have obituaries that are only a sentence long, but my book, Leviathan, The History of Whaling in America, has a big section on Herman Melville. And probably all of you know by now that Moby Dick was a total failure during his lifetime. And when he died in 1891, Harper's Monthly gave him an obituary that was just a single sentence long. And I used to joke with my local editor of the paper in Marblehead that when I die, which hopefully wouldn't be soon, you better give me an obituary that's at least a paragraph long. So we'll see if that happens, and hopefully it's in the distant future. Anyway, he ended his life in relative obscurity. Now this is on New Island. This is the Charles H. Barnard Museum on New Island. And as I had mentioned before, New Island is a nature preserve that was given by Sir Ian Strange. But if you go on a cruise, not a Disney cruise or a Carnival cruise, but sort of a nature cruise or a birding cruise, they often stop off this island. They'll take you into the island in a tender, and then you can go into the museum. And I was giving a talk earlier this year, and when I mentioned that this was a museum, a guy in the audience raised his hand and said, "That's not a museum." I said, "What?" He goes, "I was there in February. I walked in there. They're selling T-shirts and postcards." I said, "Well, I guess the tourism office of the Falklands and the people who live, one of the 5 people who live on this island, pulled the wool over my eyes because they sent me 12 photographs of the inside of this place, and it looked very much like a museum to me." And what I figured out is that during the high season, February is summer down there, they probably push all the artifacts, the musty artifacts, to the side, and they make money while they can selling souvenirs. So that's basically the end of my talk, but let me tell you how I came up with this idea, because I always get asked that question. I had finished the book, Rebels at Sea, about privateering. I needed another idea for a book. And I just sort of randomly look around. I go to libraries, I look online, I'm trying to figure out what I want to write about. I've written about maritime issues quite a bit, and I was going to stay with that for a little while longer. So I found this book that was published in 1979 by an English professor, of all people. It was an annotated list of shipwrecks and disasters from 1580 to 1860. And for each one, it had a paragraph description of what had happened, and then primary sources beneath it. So I started flipping through, and I knew a lot of the stories after all these years. You know, you read this paragraph, oh, that's in the heart of the sea, the sinking of the Essex, or that's Skeletons of the Sahara, or that's this, that, you know, all these books that have been published. And then I came upon this paragraph that talked about Charles Barnard being marooned in the Falkland Islands, and I said, I've never heard of that. And it was really interesting, and right beneath it, they said he wrote a book in 1829, and through the miracles of the internet, and I've got to tell you, in the years that I've been writing books, it has become so much easier and so much harder to write a book. Easier to get information. I saw that he wrote a book in 1829. A minute later, I had the book downloaded on my computer, and I read it that night, and I said, this is a great story. And I started looking for other stuff, and a lot of the primary source material was online. In fact, the entire court case that took place in London over the disposition of the Nina has been digitized by the archives in England. And all I had to do is pay a couple of bucks, more than a couple of bucks, to get the PDFs right in my office. So it was absolutely amazing. So that's how I came up with the idea of the book. They come from strange places sometimes. And I'm working on another book right now. This is another question I get asked. I'm working on one more shipwreck book. This is a whaling ship that wrecked in the Pacific in the 1830s. But in this story, people die, and some people are murdered. And there's a naval rescue mission, and it's a very exciting story. So I'm working on that. And after that, I'm going to write a book on puppies. because so anyway, that's it for my talk. Thanks a lot, and I'm happy to answer questions.